Anchor positioning is such a cool API, and today I want to talk through it. Now, just with CSS and HTML, you can position one element in reference to another element. Today we'll talk about how to position that element properly, the difference between absolute and fixed positioning when it comes to fallbacks, and then we'll look at a more complicated example with the Popover API and the Anchor Positioning API working together, even with some graceful fallbacks depending on where that happens to be rendered. Again, this is all just HTML and CSS, and if you're concerned about support, I'll add some links down below where you can get polyfills and get a better sense of how supported it is at the time you're viewing this. You ready? Let's go. All right, let's look at the very basics of anchor positioning, and then we'll look at some more complex examples. You can see here I've got a button and a paragraph tag. They're just normal elements. I do have classes so that we can actually identify them, because this is the anchor that we're going to want to link everything to, the button, and then this target right here is where we're going to want to move around relative to the button. So I've just given it those classes, but they don't do anything special. You can name them pizza and salad. It doesn't really matter. First thing we need to do, though, is to give this a name. So we're going to use the anchor name property. And here, like a lot of new CSS features, it starts with this double dash, and then we could do something like, I don't know, we'll call it button anchor. It doesn't really matter what you name it. Now, this target is the paragraph. This is what we're going to want to link it to. Now, it's important to note that your target needs either position absolute or position fixed. It uses this positioning with the anchor property. So we're going to use position absolute for now, and then we will change this later on. I'll show you the difference between the two. Now, by default, this whole main tag right here has position relative, so it's just going like any other absolute positioned item up here. So what we want to do is link these two things together, and we can do that with position of anchor. So position anchor, and then I'm going to reference the name we gave it, and nothing changes right now because we also need to tell it where to sit in relative position to the anchored item. So here I can use the position area, and we can use something like top, we can use bottom, we can use right, we can use center, center. So what exactly is happening here? Well, I think it's easier to see if we enable something that I've got here. Just to be a little helper, we're going to turn our data grid to true, which makes kind of this whole grid area here. And if I look at the layout here, which I've just basically said, hey, show me the grid lines, you can see we've got 9 quadrants. Now, I've made this real even just so you can see what's going on, but this is relative to these 9 quadrants. So if I change this to top center, you'll notice that the paragraph tag goes to the top center. I could go, I don't know, we could go left over here, and left center takes it left center. We could go top and right, and you'll see it goes to the top right. Now, because I've now got this in a grid container, you'll see it's also sitting in its grid sections. But now that we understand that, let me turn this back to false so we can see a couple other things we may want to know about. And we'll change the position area to say bottom. So it's just going to be in the bottom, and by default, it'll be in the center of that section. Now, what if I want it to start on the left-hand side and move over here? Well, in addition to the top, right, left, and bottom, we can also use the idea of spanning. So we can say start in the bottom, and I want you to span to the right, which means it'll start right here and try to span over this way. Now, if you make it to where it can't fit, it then moves over so it handles itself gracefully, naturally. Now, you may notice that I've got margin 0 on here, which a lot of times the resets have that. And if you want to like move it off here, you can't use a gap, but you can use an actual margin. Now, what I might want to do here, let's come up top here. We're just going to say margin block. So this is up and down, a logical property. We'll say something like 1 rem, which moves it off by 1 rem. Now, the reason I did margin block is we may actually want it to like flip. So right now it's on the bottom, but maybe I'm scrolling or I'm in a position where that would take it off the screen. Well, in that case, I'd want it to actually go to the top. So I've got another little helper here, data large. We're going to change this to true just so we can simulate this. So I'll come inside here. You'll see that we want it on the bottom, but sometimes I might come in here like this and it can't fit on the bottom. Now, what is it going to do? Well, it's off the screen right now, and this is actually one thing we want to explore. So we can use what's called position try fallbacks, and it's fallbacks because you can provide multiples of them here. So I can say, hey, try to the top, and if you can't fit to the top, maybe go left, something like that. So now if I come back over here, you'll see right here it can't really fit, and it should be flipping, but it's not doing that. And this is one of the differences between position absolute and position of fixed. If I change it to here and we scroll down, you'll see it's actually at the top. And then when it can't fit at the top anymore, then it should return to the bottom. Now, what's going on here? Well, the Anchor Positioning API cares about the target elements containing block. So if I keep this with absolute, this would be the entire section, this main tag, and it never really leaves that section. It's still inside of that section. Whereas if I change this to fixed, the way position fixed works is it kind of sits on top of the screen here. And so eventually it gets to the point where then it can't, it's going to actually scroll this paragraph off the containing block itself, which is the position fixed. So that's one little note to note about these try fallbacks is usually you need to use position fixed for the target element. Now, there are other ways to define these, and without getting too technical, there's a couple different specs, but there is one that works really well, and that is simply flip block. all this says is basically flip it back and forth. And this is actually much better supported as well. So you can see if I come here and it eventually needs to flip, it can flip the block like that. And notice I don't have to say like span right or anything like that, or top span right. It just figures it out. It flips between the two. So that's the basics of using anchor positioning. You define an anchor name, make sure you have position fixed or absolute, and then you tie this target to the anchor with position anchor and define an area and fallbacks if you want to. Now, what about another realistic scenario? Let me come over here and we're gonna change this to false, and then let's enable the nav container. All right, so what do we have here? Well, we have a button and we have a nav. And ultimately, I want to show this only when I've clicked on this button. But then I want to be able to position this wherever I want. So over here, if it happens to be this way, maybe the other way. If it happens to be down at the bottom, then maybe I want it to be above. And I can do all this with both the Popover API, which I talked about in my last video, and we'll briefly go over today, and this anchor positioning and all the different behaviors there. So the first thing to do is to throw on a popover attribute here, which turns this into a popover. I don't need to give it a name, but I can come over here, and then next in the button, I want to set a popover target. We'll simply point this to the ID, which is nav menu. That means whenever I click on this, it should show this popover. Now, I get all the nice things where if I click off, it works. If I come over here and hit escape, it also works. It reselects that. All this happens by default. I get all this accessibility. Now, here's where I want to use that positioning. So let's take what we know and put it into practice. I'm going to grab this nav button. We'll jump over to our CSS, and let's just do it right here. So we're going to take this and we're going to use the anchor name, and we'll just call this like nav button. How about that? Now we've got the nav itself. And here, just like we did below, I'm going to use a position anchor. So let's grab this right here. I'll pop this up, and then I'll do nav button. Lastly, I'll take position area, and let's set this to the bottom. Now you'll notice a couple of things. First of all, I didn't have to put position fixed. Why is that? Well, it's because by default, Popover adds that already. But maybe I want to take the bottom and I want to span it to the right. And once again, I'm going to take margin block. We'll set this to 1 rep. Now that means if I click off here, it should close. If I open it, there it is right there, and everything's automatically working. All right, now I've changed a little bit of CSS. We've moved it over to the right. If I click on this now, you'll see it kind of hugs the edge here. So maybe actually when it's over here, I want it to be able to move over and start here and go left. And we can do that with some properties we've already seen. I'll use position try fallbacks. And here we'll say if it can't do what we've already defined up top here, which is bottom span right, then I want it to do bottom span left. You'll notice that's exactly what it does. If I move it back over, so let's come back over here, we're going to comment this out. You'll see over here, it tries this one first, and only if it's in a state where it can't move that way, then it starts bottom and it spans to the left. It's crazy that you can do all this with just HTML and CSS. Again, check out the browser support below if you have questions. And if you're interested more in the Popover API, along with some cool ways to animate that in and out, then check out the video I've got right here. Thanks. I'll catch you in the next one. Happy coding.